the search for an appropriate conceptual framework has to be continuous. Like, we can never simply rest assured with the concepts that we use to study any process in the world. We constantly need to almost smash our concepts against the complexities of reality and see if the concepts survive that process, and see if we can fine-tune and reinvent the concepts in relation to the changing world and the changing concerns that we as researchers have. I mean, that dialectic between concept formation and research and action, that has to be endemic to like any form of critical social science.
What was the context on this very influential article? Where were you at that time?
I was doing my doctoral degree in political science at the University of Chicago, and I was actually doing my field work in Frankfurt and Amsterdam during the year, trying to understand changes in urban and regional governance in both of those zones. And I was trying to get clear about the conceptual framework and the methodological framework that I was trying to use to make sense of some of the transformations that I saw all around me.
And when you talk about transformation, I mean, what do you mean? What was the goal of that paper?
Well, the transformations that were happening were pretty dramatic at that particular time in Europe. The single European market had been established. The euro had been established. So European integration was proceeding and accelerating apace, and that was occurring in a context of ongoing processes of what at the time were referred to as globalization, the nature of which was a matter of considerable debate. A lot of geographical concepts were being used to talk about globalization, the idea of an acceleration of economic integration, dismantling of various inherited borders, the supposed decline of the national state, and the notion of hypermobile capital. And meanwhile, on the ground, beneath the national scale in Europe, even as the European Union was gaining authority and gaining kind of institutional thickness, all kinds of transformations of urban governance were occurring. Local institutions were mobilizing in increasingly competitive ways to try to attract investment to their locality. So the idea of interspatial competition or interlocality competition was of great concern all across Europe, and simultaneously new layers of governance were either being planned or actually established that were larger than existing localities. So they were metropolitan or even regional in scale. Of course, metropolitan governance, regional governance has a long history in Europe and around the world. But what was interesting about what I was seeing when I did this research was that the new forms of regionalism or metropolitanism were oriented less towards social goals and physical planning goals than towards economic development goals. And that was really the focal point of the interviews and the research I was doing in both Holland and in Germany, was the consolidation of regionalisms or metropolitanisms that seemed to be oriented above all towards attracting inward investment and strategically positioning the regions and the cities in question within the European market and also within the global market.
How you position your your goal and your take on this paper in relation with current debates on globalization that at that time were very pregnant?
So the conceptual goal was actually quite fundamental because, again, the dominant discourses of globalization at that time emphasized the decline of the national state, the annihilation of distance, the construction of a supposedly borderless world, and hypermobile capital. And in the context of what I was seeing of the production of new forms of governance and territorial organization at urban and at regional scales, it generated a very different understanding and a very different map of what this process of globalization looked like. Instead of a space of flows, it actually seemed to be about reorganizing territorial organization, producing new institutions, new geographies at local, regional, and broader scales in order precisely to facilitate the new forms of capital mobility and flow and exchange that had attracted the attention of globalization theorists at that time. So the problematique of territorial organization, which of course had long been of central concern to urbanists and geographers, suddenly seemed to be absolutely central as a radical counterpoint to the dominant discourses of European integration and globalization that simply viewed it as a space of flows and as a borderless world.
I would like if you can explain us what the concept of rescaling is. It's very clear in your articulation that there is this interplay among different scales, but what is rescaling? How rescaling is helpful as a concept? How you mobilize it?
The notion of scale has for a long time been central to geography and to more generally any kind of spatial analysis, and it generally just refers to the resolution at which an analysis occurs. But when I was working on this project, Eric Swingedow and Neil Smith, among others, had introduced a radical and I found extremely productive approach to scale that had a lot of implications for what I was trying to study. So in that argument, two key propositions. Scale is not simply a cartographic lens, an epistemological lens, but it's an actual material dimension of the social relations of capitalism. So capitalism itself produces a hierarchy of spatial organization that is scale differentiated from the urban to the regional to the national to the global. So that proposition was highly important because it suggested that the scales were actual material and even territorial infrastructures of capitalism rather than just an epistemological lens. But most importantly, the scalar organization of capitalism is not fixed. So Neil Smith emphasized that uneven spatial development is mediated through scalar hierarchies. But what Neil then later, also in dialogue with Eric, elaborated was that the scalar hierarchies which mediate uneven spatial development, they change. In that context, the claim was that the process of so-called globalization was actually better understood as a recalibration of inherited scalar hierarchies. Rescaling basically means the reorganization of scalar hierarchy, the reorganization of the relations between different scales through some kind of social, political, and economic process. That's a pretty simple, straightforward definition of rescaling. The specific rescaling processes that I was trying to study in this article involved the rescaling of national state space. So the claim was that the Fordist Keynesian developmentalist period of capitalism, roughly post-World War II up until the global economic crises in the 1970s, involved a nationalized territorialization of capitalism. Still in a global system, absolutely a formation of the world economy, but a formation of the world economy in which the national state tried to regulate relatively closed national economic systems. So definitely a scalar architecture within which local and regional economies were embedded, and the national economies and the national states were in turn embedded within a global system. And the claim that we were developing at that time was that that nationalized formation of capitalism and territorial organization was being reorganized, not to create a space of flows, a borderless world, the kind of ideological visions of the globalization debate, but rather to create rescaled geographies of capital accumulation, of urbanization, and of state power. In the context of the article, the concept of rescaling provided a very powerful conceptual lens through which to reorganize our understanding of many of the transformations of local and regional governance, of national territorial organization, and more generally of the global geography of uneven development that were proliferating around that time. It forced us to effectively territorialize the whole globalization debate. Instead of just emphasizing networks and flows, we could actually study the ways in which new forms of rescaled territorial organization within urban regions, within governance systems, were being produced as a kind of infrastructure to facilitate that new phase of capitalist development.
There is a lot of literature on urban governance. What was your position? It was a critique, what you were trying to do through the concept of rescaling?
So there's a huge literature on urban governance, that it existed, it's as long as the field of urban studies, really, trying to understand the role of local institutions in creating different kinds of urban space. And I was obviously building upon that work, particularly the kind of American urban political economy literature, the literature on growth machines, very foundational. But the concern that I had at that time, and which really continued to be a concern as I worked in the field of urban governance, was that much of the field was methodologically localist. And what I mean by that is simply that it focused on existing municipal institutions in relation to an entity described as or understood as the city, but didn't really systematically or reflexively interrogate the ways in which those local institutions were embedded within broader intergovernmental and institutional hierarchies, or the ways in which those intergovernmental or institutional hierarchies were changing in relation to broader political and economic changes. So in that context, the grammar of rescaling provided a way to kind of shake up inherited ideas of urban governance in which the urban was pre-given and it was being governed by some set of actors or coalitions or regimes. So by elaborating a rescaling perspective, I was able to continue to look at the formation of local and even regional territorial alliances to promote particular projects of governance, but at the same time to understand, or at least to try to investigate, their relations to and their embeddedness within broader institutional systems. In the European context, that meant both national governments, which were reorganizing revenue streams, policy relays, in all kinds of new ways, as well as their relation to broader processes of European integration, which were also radically transforming the landscape of local and regional development in very important ways.
So how you position again this paper in relation with that? I mean, because global cities debates were somehow rendering the kind of state as kind of powerless. How you reposition your article in relation with this global cities theory?
Yeah. So what that literature really productively emphasized was the ways in which global cities offered a fixed and immobile infrastructure of territorial organization that enabled broader processes of transnational corporate production and circulation and financial flows to exist. So without these global cities, the broader processes of globalization were impossible. And that actually these new global city infrastructures were being facilitated in significant measure through state strategies, not only at the local level, but also at the national level. And that was also a central concern of this article, was to show how the local spaces of globalization were produced not only by local governments or by regional governments, but by reorganized national state institutions. So in fact, the very construction of those global cities hinged upon not simply state strategies, but that national state institutions were reorganizing themselves in important ways to develop new policies and new ways of facilitating economic development within their territories. So suddenly the question of the national state was central to the agenda. The national state was involved directly in facilitating global city formation, contrary to what several global city theorists had argued, which was that the national state was in decline and that the global cities were simply being facilitated through local governments. Actually, I was arguing something very different. National states were facilitating global city formation, particularly in the European context, although one can certainly debate about that same proposition in other zones of the world economy, both North American and East Asian.
Your analytical position is very clear, but are you trying to criticize what those transformations that were occurring at that time? Is really are you having a critical position on that?
I mean, it was absolutely intended as a critique of dominant trends in urban governance in the European Union. The claim, very simply, was that economic development priorities were superseding broader agendas of social redistribution, cohesion, territorial integration. Many of those concepts, like cohesion, foremost among them, remain very important, including in official discourse. But the claim was that a kind of new competitive geography of zero-sum competition, beggar thy neighbor competition, was emerging, which effectively involved a kind of transfer of public and social resources to private capital for private gain. And that's been a big debate throughout the whole formation of the European Union. Is the EU a social and political organization that represents the common will of the European population to promote a kind of collective, redistributive, solidaristic project? Or is it basically an organization to facilitate trade and to facilitate capital accumulation? At the time that I was writing, the neoliberal moment of the EU was massively intensifying and consolidating. And in that context, the processes of urban governance restructuring that I was studying were really pretty destructive and pretty detrimental. What's really disturbing and kind of remarkable in many ways is that the dominant response to the global financial crisis of the last few years, not only in Europe, but around the world, has actually further entrenched and consolidated the hegemony of a kind of neoliberal framework. So that continues to be mobilized in the European Union despite any number of kinds of destructive consequences, both for governance and for the broader social fabric. So if anything, I think that kind of critique of local economic development policy needs to continue.
Why did you, let's say, focus on the European Union as a kind of case study to try to understand these processes?
So for somewhat contingent reasons, I was drawn to Europe just in the early part of my graduate studies, and that simply led me to focus my research in a comparative vein on European cities. The article gives examples from across Europe, particularly Germany and the Netherlands, but there are also a few references to other transformations of urban governance within Europe, of course in the UK, a little bit in France, a little bit elsewhere within the EU. But what's interesting is that a lot of the processes of the rescaling of urban governance that I discussed in that article have been happening around the world. Some years after writing that article, I wrote a short piece that tried to study different forms of metropolitan governance reorganization in the United States, basically using the same method, a rescaling of urban governance. In the United States, urban governance has been localized for a very long time, as Harvey Malich and John Logan argued a long time ago in terms of local growth machines. But even in the United States, there have been processes of rescaling in which different intergovernmental shifts have caused local institutions to play an even greater role in mobilizing economic development from below. In more recent years, a number of colleagues such as Bae-Gyun Park and many others, Asato Saito, have looked at the rescaling of urban governance in East Asia. So rescaling seems to be happening in urban governance systems around the world.
This resonates very much with current preoccupations that you are developing now as director of the Urban Theory Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Could you tell us the importance and the relevance today of creating new concepts, new categories of analysis to understand the processes and the ongoing processes of urbanization today?
Most of the research that I've done that's been concrete and embedded within particular places has been fundamentally motivated by broader theoretical, conceptual questions. And that's also the case with the work that we're doing now in the Urban Theory Lab on some of the places around the world that are undergoing new forms of urbanization. It's very much driven by a concern to refine, reinvent, and elaborate new concepts for thinking, which in turn can inform potentially new approaches to research and maybe also new approaches to action, new approaches to strategy. It's very concrete, it's very cartographic, but that work continues to be animated by the broader challenges of developing and refining new theoretical concepts. But I think that the point is that there has to be a dialectic between concrete research that's theoretically reflexive, theoretically aware of the concepts that are being used rather than simply presupposing them, but by the same token, purely theoretical speculation that's divorced from concrete elaborations is potentially not as productive as it could be, because ultimately the test of even the most abstract concept in the social sciences is, does it help illuminate our understanding of particular processes that are happening at different spatial and temporal scales? So I really believe in that kind of old Marxian idea of a dialectical spiral between concrete research, conceptual refinement, concrete research, conceptual refinement. There are different ways to move up and down that spiral, but I think that's really a methodological precondition or presupposition in some ways of this particular paper, and it still continues to be at least an aspiration for me in the research that I do, is to, even when I'm on a very abstract level, to try to connect it back down to the concrete. We always use concepts anytime we do research on anything. In the field of urban studies, then, today, really always, we presuppose any number of concepts about what the urban is. We're always presupposing, for example, geographical assumptions when we use these concepts. And that's a very complicated thing because, as we know, it's clear that the geographies of capitalism, the geographies of globalization, they're changing all the time, all around us. So the concepts try to grasp the process of change, but how can they do that? Because the world is constantly changing, and if the concepts stay the same, they may become obsolete or superseded. I fundamentally believe that we need to devote as much attention and as much energy to testing and reinventing the concepts that we use, the theories that we use to study the world, as we do to the actual concrete research on particular topics. Because if the concepts are obsolete or inadequate or misleading, our whole framework for research could be filled with assumptions that are actually problematic. I think in some ways the article was written and published at a moment when a number of ideas were crystallizing around the importance of a dynamic understanding of scale, and I was advancing that collective project forward. But the broader issue again is the search for conceptual tools. It has to be ongoing, it has to be dynamic, and it has to be collective.